Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And Sir Ronald Cohen, Ronnie, thank you so much for your very kind words of introduction. And congratulations to you and your team. Amit Bhatia, congratulations on what the GSG has been doing. Prince Max, other distinguished guests who are here, and really to all of you, thank you for putting in the time and energy to think through this most important challenge of how to create an impact economy and how to match impact investing with the great challenge of our time. My co-founder and my partner and co-founder of Generation Investment Management, David Blood, spoke here yesterday, had to leave early, very early this morning to get back to London, but I wanted to acknowledge my debt and gratitude to him, because today is the precise 15th anniversary of when David and I first met and founded Generation Investment Management. So I want to spend a few minutes talking with you about this combination, social impact and environmental impact investing, and how we as a global civilization can address what is now an existential threat to the survival of civilization as we know it. You would be surprised if I did not concentrate in my remarks somewhat on the climate crisis. I'll begin there, but then talk about the other dimensions of this larger crisis. I said briefly last night that the climate crisis is the single most dangerous manifestation of an underlying collision between our civilization as we currently pursue it, as we have currently organized it, and the ecological system of the earth upon which our civilization depends and on which our species depends. One of the philosophical mistakes that all of the great faith traditions of our world teach us is the mistake in believing that we as human beings are somehow separate from the rest of creation, separate from nature, separate from one another. We are interdependent, and we are much more dependent upon the ecological balance that has given rise to the flourishing of civilization than we usually allow ourselves to realize. My first awareness of the climate crisis came from a great teacher in the 1960s who had served here in India as the head of USAID under President John F. Kennedy. He was one of the greatest climate scientists that ever lived. His name was Roger Revelle. And I was lucky enough to walk into his classroom when I was a college student in the 1960s, and he was a great teacher and opened my eyes to this crisis, and everything that has happened in the 50 years since has simply filled in more details in the picture that he painted so vividly a half century ago. 40 years ago this fall, I entered the U.S. Congress as a freshman member of the House of Representatives and immediately asked, because of my teacher, what's going on with global warming, and the answer was nothing. And 40 years ago this fall, I organized the first congressional hearing on global warming. I invited my professor to come and be the lead-off witness, Ronnie, and I naively expected that my colleagues on the dais would experience the same kind of epiphany that I had experienced, but a 20-minute congressional statement turned out to be not quite the same experience as a full college course. And it was in that moment that I first began to ask myself the question, how can this scientific insight, and in the years since all the details that have been filled in, how can this insight be communicated more clearly to reproduce the aha moment that I had personally experienced. And that began the journey that I am still on today. So the most vulnerable part of the Earth's ecological system is the very thin shell of atmosphere surrounding our planet. When you walk outside on a clear day and look up at the sky, it seems like a vast and limitless expanse, but in reality, the thinness of the shell surrounding us is quite startling in the contrast to this visceral impression we have of the sky. If you could drive an automobile at highway speeds straight up in the air, you would get to the top of the sky in about 5 minutes. And that thin shell of atmosphere is now being used as an open sewer for the gaseous waste of our civilization. And because we still depend on fossil fuels for 80% of all the energy that our global economy uses, that means that we put 110 million tons of heat-trapping, man-made global warming pollution into that thin shell every 24 hours. For 3 of the last 4 years, the global emissions have stabilized, and that's good news, except that they have stabilized at an absurdly high level. And each year's annual additions are added to the amount that is already there. And these heat-trapping gases stay in the atmosphere for quite a long time. And the cumulative amount now, each day, traps as much extra heat energy in the atmosphere and the oceans that would be equal to the amount of heat energy released by 500,000 first-generation atomic bombs exploding every day. Think about that for a moment. A Hiroshima-class atomic bomb multiplied by 500,000 every single day. It's a big planet, but that is an enormous amount of energy. We are all, in a sense, trapped inside this shell of atmosphere, and the level of heat energy in which we and all other living things live matters a lot, because we and they have all adapted to the conditions that are ideal for us, that we used to enjoy. So this extra heat energy is having first and second and third order consequences. First of all, the heat itself causes heat stress and kills vulnerable people, the elderly, the homeless, infants, those with disabilities, those who have respiratory conditions. And in some areas of our world, the temperature increases are now reaching levels that threaten to make significant regions unlivable, uninhabitable. I don't know, I should have checked whether or not it is common in India to use the phrase heat index. In the US, heat index measures the combination of heat and humidity. And the weather forecast, or in Canada they call it the humidex. It's what the temperature feels like. In several cities in the Middle East and North Africa, the heat index has on some occasions already reached 74 degrees Celsius, 165 degrees Fahrenheit. No human being, no matter how healthy, can live for more than a few hours in such conditions. I hold regular 3-day trainings around the world, not as part of Generation Investment Management, but as part of the Climate Reality Project. I just finished a training for 2,300 new activists in Los Angeles. A few months ago, I had a training in Berlin, and we invited some of the German scientists who, at the Max Planck Institute, have studied these areas that are in danger of becoming uninhabitable. Why, I asked, Are there droughts when the humidity is so high? And the answer is that it's not as if it doesn't rain in those conditions. It does rain. But before the rain reaches the ground, it completely evaporates. A second question, the answer to which should have been obvious to me, well, at what point does it get to an unlivable state where people just leave? He said, oh, you don't understand. They leave before it gets to that point. The number of climate refugees, by the way, is a term not accepted under international law. The Treaty of 1951, which sets obligations for the treatment of refugees, is very precise in defining refugees as individuals who have a palpable fear of persecution by the governments in the regions from which they are trying to escape. If it's climate making their homes unlivable and they leave for that reason, they're not, technically speaking, refugees. Does it matter? Actually, challenging vocabulary and challenging standard categories of thought that we use as our world changes is part of the challenge that we face. It's true in economics as well, and I will get to that in just a moment. But the flows of refugees, let's take Syria as an example. Everyone focuses on the civil war there, yes, but before the civil war began in Syria, the worst drought in all of recorded history, records going back in the Eastern Mediterranean only 900 years, from 2006 to 2010, killed 80% of the goats and the cattle and the sheep, destroyed 60% of the farms, drove all of these climate refugees into the cities of Syria, and the releases from WikiLeaks recording the conversations among the Syrian ministers, again before the civil war began, had them saying to one another, all hell is going to break loose. We cannot handle this. What's going to happen? And the civil war began. Other causes, Assad, proxy sectarian wars, other factors. But the precipitating cause was the fact that the rural areas had become unlivable and the farming economy was destroyed. And people from different tribal groups and religious sects were pushed together, along with refugees from the Iraq War, which had already arrived, And the refugee flows were much larger in the neighboring countries, but the world's news media focused on those going across the Mediterranean to Europe. Look at what's been happening in Europe. The great experiment of the European Union, one of the most uplifting and spiritually inspiring movements of modern history, is now under challenge. Hungary, Poland, even Brexit. One of the two most powerful billboards in the idiotic Brexit campaign. I'm sorry if I'm offending someone here. Your reaction tells me there are no Russian bots in the room. But one of the two most powerful billboards was a billboard common in the UK at the time, showing a seemingly endless line of refugees, obviously from the Middle East and North Africa, with the slogan, "The EU has failed us all." In neighboring Bangladesh, neighboring to where we are, the common practice used to be in southern Bangladesh in the delta areas for big storms to wipe out villages once every 20 years, and people would rebuild their lives. Now it's once every 7 years. And it turns out to be humanly impossible for most families to rebuild their lives on that cycle. And so Dhaka is crowded, and the biggest steel fence in the world has been completed on India's southern border with Bangladesh. And I could give you examples from places all across this world. Sea level rise. The worst case estimates are that throughout this century, as many as 2 billion people could be driven from coastal cities and communities toward the interior of the continents on which they live. Not to mention the exodus from drought-stricken and heat-stressed regions. And speaking of the heat, it's not only humans, it's also plants. All of the plants upon which we depend today were carefully selected over many generations of Neolithic women until the patient sorting of seeds for those with the most nutritional value for the next generation became the broccolis and the squash and the corn or maize and the other food that we eat today. Those food crops were optimized for the conditions that we are now recklessly changing. Yesterday, as several of you have noted in brief exchanges with me, this rather stunning report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Ipcc, came out in Korea. This report was mandated at the Paris conference to see if it might be possible to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees. And when the scientists, after 3 years of work, looked at it, they said, oh my God, it's technically possible, but we have to warn the world that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees means a lot and gives us a much better chance of containing the suffering that will be inflicted on future generations and on people alive today. And it's the poor that are first afflicted, as everyone knows. But in this report, they say that crop yields are going down because these plants that were optimized 10,000 years ago for the conditions that were present when the first human cities were built, when agriculture was invented, when our civilization in its current form was shaped and set in motion, those conditions are now what is at risk. And if we do not change, we are headed toward 3 to 4 degrees Celsius increase, which is associated with such utter catastrophes that it is difficult to speak of them, lest we induce paralysis. Because some people, you know, are prone to go straight from denial to despair without pausing on the intermediate step of actually solving the crisis that is threatening the future of our civilization. And that's where we are in this meeting. Now, to put these remarks in context, there are really only 3 questions remaining to be asked about the climate crisis and this larger ecological crisis. Must we change? Can we change? Will we change? What I've said thus far is in part to address that first question, must we change? Yes, we must change, not only because of what I've cited thus far, but because we are disrupting the water cycle of the planet upon which life depends. Today, in my country, we're about to be hit by another huge hurricane. Just 3 weeks ago, Hurricane Florence was the 10th largest hurricane in history, and I won't go through the disasters that unfolded, partly because the Western news media barely noticed the fact that on the same day Hurricane Florence hit North and South Carolina, Super Typhoon Mangkhut blazed through Luzon in the Philippines and then shattered buildings in Hong Kong. Maybe the first time that 2 super cyclonic storms hit on opposite sides of the planet on the exact same day. The researchers will tell us if that's correct or not. It's the first time in my memory. And just 1 year ago, in my country, Hurricane Harvey hit the center of the petrochemical industry of the world in Houston, Texas, and dropped 5 feet of rain. If you've ever seen pictures of Niagara Falls, perhaps a few of you have visited it, imagine the full flow of Niagara Falls for 500 days, 509 days. That's how much water dropped on Texas and Louisiana in 5 days. And these are becoming quite commonplace. Think of Super Typhoon Haiyan, or as it was called in the Philippines, Yolanda. 4 million climate refugees. In my country, this Florence hurricane was the 5th once-in-a-thousand-year event in the last 12 months. Now, the statisticians are here. It's an investment conference, so I'm sure there's some statisticians here. Will tell you that that math doesn't work very well. And the math, just like the categories of vocabulary and thought and economics, are becoming woefully obsolete because we're changing our world in a highly dangerous and destructive way. What are the other reasons we must change? Tropical diseases are moving to higher latitudes. The ice is melting. Sea level is rising. The storm surges are much larger now. We are a coastal species in the main. And the ice melts in the places where the ice is located. And I say it that way because this is a little bit complicated, so forgive me. It's important though. The Arctic is covered with ice. And when the ice melts, the sun's rays no longer bounce off back into space. They're absorbed by the dark ocean and the dark land surrounding the Arctic Ocean. And so it's an accelerator, a magnifier. So a 1 degree increase at the equator is a 3 degree increase in the Arctic. And a 4 degree increase at the equator would be a 12 or more degree increase in the Arctic. Now, why is that important? 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, when those plants were selected, when the first cities were started, the climate equilibrium settled into a recognizable pattern that has been pretty stable for the entirety of urban civilization. And the mathematicians here could explain this much better than me, but the shape of that equilibrium is defined in significant part by the ratio of temperature at the equator to temperature at the poles, because the Earth is a complex system that tends to even itself out. Professor Ravel, 50 years ago, taught me that the climate system is a giant engine for redistributing heat from the tropics to the poles, through the wind currents and the ocean currents, and storm systems, and complicated events like El Nino. When that ratio of temperatures changes, think of it as x over y. And if you have x plus 1 over y plus 3, then the mathematics defining that pattern change radically. And so the ocean currents are changing now. The Gulf Stream, for example, is slowing down. The wind currents are changing. The Northern Hemisphere jet stream, which normally comes across Eurasia and across North America and moves these storms out to the east, now is becoming disorganized. That's why Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Harvey just stayed in place for so long, pouring water down. That's why the droughts that normally, caused by conditions that are normally pushed east in the northern hemisphere, west in the southern hemisphere, they stay now. They strike more deeply, they last longer, they do more damage. Today, the worst drought in the history of New South Wales in Australia is underway. Mongolia's had its worst drought ever. The Korean Peninsula in the southwestern United States. And where there's drought, there are fires. We've had the worst fires in the history of the United States in California and elsewhere in the West. We had a fire tornado with temperatures of 2,400 degrees and wind speeds equivalent to these cyclonic storms. Every night on the television news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. It's insane. And often the newscasters do not connect the dots, but we have to. It's a challenge, truly, because in describing events that sound apocalyptic, you run the risk not only of the paralysis I mentioned earlier or the movement from denial to despair, but also just people shutting their minds. I don't want to hear bad news. 50% of all the living species on this planet are at risk of extinction in this century. The coral reefs are already damaged and are at risk of completely disappearing. And I could go on with the list of horrible consequences, but to sum them up, must we change? Yes, we must change. And by the way, governance, especially self-governance, is itself at risk. Some nations are challenged even in the best of climates and the best of conditions. And when you overlay these burdens, then the risk of chaos and violence increases significantly. Must we change? Yes, we must change. Second question, equally important. Can we change? If we have to change and we don't have the ability to change, then party on is the reaction of many, because that's a formula for depression and anxiety. But here is the good news. We can change. Relief is heaven sent in the form of solar and wind and ingenuity and technology. We are seeing the kind of cost reduction curves for solar electricity and wind electricity, and now battery storage and electric vehicles and a whole host of efficiency improvements that we could barely even dream of just 5-10 years ago. It's almost like what Moore's Law did for computing. It's startling to the point where renewable electricity is now cheaper in most geographies than electricity from burning fossil fuels. We can do this. And more than that, we are now in the early stages of a sustainability revolution, which has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, but it has the speed of the Digital Revolution. And it's based in part on new digital tools like the Internet of Things and machine learning and artificial intelligence and blockchain and supercomputing and their equivalents in biology with CRISPR and all manner of new advances. And these tools are giving many executive teams the ability to manage electrons and atoms and molecules and proteins and cells and genes with the same precision that the IT companies have demonstrated in managing bits of information. One quick example, Google has the largest server farms of any company in the world, and they bought an artificial intelligence company near where Ronnie lives, DeepMind, and they asked the two leaders of this company, Demis Hassabis and Mustafa Suleyman, to see if they could reduce the energy consumption in these server farms. Long story short, no new hardware, increased processing of information. They cut, just with artificial intelligence, they cut the energy consumption by 56%. And there are thousands of use cases where the same thing can be done. And we've seen the disruptions that have accompanied the digital revolution. These disruptions, for good and bad, mostly for good, will be even larger. We can change. Can we solve the financial flows that are necessary to provide capital for this massive transition in energy production, in transportation, in manufacturing and the making of steel and aluminum, the adoption of a circular economy, the sustainable management of forests and topsoils? That's what this historic fourth annual conference is designed to address. And some of the particulars are still being worked out, I realize that. But let's all acknowledge that the conventional thought categories of global capitalism, I'm a capitalist. You know, the 20th century was an experiment with alternatives to capitalism. Didn't work out very well. And by the way, the environmental consequences of command and control economies of the left and the right were far worse than anything that capitalist economies have created. But let's acknowledge that capitalism today is fundamentally flawed. And these flaws have to be addressed. On the left, we now see a rising ferment to identify capitalism as the underlying cause of these problems. You have heard it, maybe some of you are saying it. But I believe that capitalism is our ally if it can be reformed and fixed. And this effort here that Ronnie and Amit and your colleagues are trying to find your way through is an essential task. What are the flaws? Well, in 1937, a brilliant economist named Simon Kuznets won the Nobel Prize in Economics for creating the accounting system that we call GDP, gross domestic product, and the corporate accounting categories that are in use ubiquitously today are derived from these concepts. Interestingly, Simon Kuznets said when he was honored, "Please do not use this system as a guide for economic policy." Why? He pointed out that as good as these categories are and as helpful as they are, remember this was the interwar period in the wake of the Great Depression when policymakers were clamoring for better tools to try to avoid the kind of economic catastrophe that had opened the door to World War II and with all its horrors, and so people were relieved. And he said, please don't use this though. It's an advance, I get that, and thank you, but don't use it as a guide to national economic policy. 7 years later, in 1944 at Bretton Woods, it was codified. And it has been used ever since, like the QWERTY keyboard, and people are reluctant to change it. What were the flaws? He pointed them out. What's not measured? Negative externalities. Pollution is the iconic example, like all that 110 million tons we're putting into the sky today, like it's an open sewer. Positive externalities, that doesn't get much attention. What are they? Well, if a community or a nation invests in mental health care or family services or community services, that's an expense. Mark it down. The benefits that come rolling back in the years following, oh no, we don't measure that. That's a positive externality. So that's left out. Depletion of natural resources like groundwater. And here in India, there is the impending threat of a groundwater shortage that could, if not addressed urgently, cause untold suffering. Out of sight, out of mind. Northern China the same way. Parts of Africa, I could give you other examples. Topsoils. In my country, for every kilogram of grain grown in the Midwest, several kilograms of topsoil go out the mouth of the Mississippi River. The web of living species upon which we depend. These are resources, the depletion of which are not measured in the categories that define our thinking about capitalism today. What else? The distribution of net worths and incomes. So this recently worsening crisis of inequality in the world, in developing and developed countries. Of course, on a global basis, the so-called Gini coefficient, which is the most common way to measure this, is actually moving in the right direction because of the wholesale transfer of jobs and processes and opportunities from developed countries to emerging economies. That's a good thing in the main, although it's contributed to a political crisis in my country and the UK and other developed economies. But within developed economies and within the developing economies, the incomes are going much more to the very top. Everybody knows that. But when you add all of these flaws together, what do you get? Well, you get policies that are aimed at increasing the measure that we focus on, measure what matters, that's what we say matters, GDP goes up and people applaud, but it's accompanied by massive increases in pollution, chronic underinvestment in public goods, depletion of vital natural resources that replenish themselves so slowly that they will never catch up at the rate of depletion, and rising inequality that is a threat to capitalism and democracy alike. And we have this wave of populist authoritarianism now sweeping many parts of the world, not least in my country. And we have journalists murdered in countries like Russia, perhaps now in a consulate in Turkey, we don't know yet. In Bulgaria yesterday, journalists declared enemies of the people in my country. What a disgrace and a shame. But don't let me get sidetracked here. So the future of self-governance, the future of agriculture, the future of our civilization itself is very much at risk. We do have the technologies. We need the financing mechanisms. David Blood and I have focused on demonstrating that the full integration of sustainability factors and ESG factors into traditional asset management can actually enhance returns. And I don't see some wood to knock on, but so far so good. But the vast flows of capital that are needed mean that impact finance is a crucial part of the solution. And we have to find how to get the passive investors involved. And you had a good session yesterday on getting the pension funds involved. So this is an important task that you're addressing. Now, the third and final question is, well, must we change? Yes. Can we change? Yes. Will we change? That's the question. Sometimes we must and we can't. Sometimes we must and we can, and then we don't. This is not a choice. Who are we as human beings? Is the combination of an opposable thumb and a neocortex an appropriate combination on this planet? Are we doomed to destroy ourselves? I refuse to believe that. Yes, we have limitations, and yes, the legacy of our long evolution and growth have left us with artifacts of past survival struggles. Yes, of course, but we also have the ability to transcend those limitations, and we have done it in the past, perhaps never with the speed necessary now, as the Ipcc alerted us again yesterday. But we do have the capacity. And by the way, we are seeing tremendous signs of progress. Many cities are already going to 100% renewable energy and making other changes to address these social challenges. California, the largest of the US states, if it were a country, it would be the 5th largest national economy in the world, has just passed and signed a law requiring 100% renewable energy by 2045 and zero carbon by 2045 by executive order. Many other regional governments are doing it. China has just begun to implement a carbon trading scheme. Several other countries have adopted it. Some of our states have this on the ballot just 3 weeks from now, and I'm hoping they will pass. And on a national level, the Paris Agreement really was an historic breakthrough. 195 nations, 193 of them, the 2 exceptions were Syria and Nicaragua, agreed to go to net zero global warming pollution by mid-century. Syria and Nicaragua joined so that all 195 nations became legally obligated. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, Donald Trump made a speech. But what many do not realize is that under international law and under US law, and the US is a nation under law as of right now, will continue to be. Under law, the first day the US could actually withdraw from the Paris Agreement happens to be the first day after the next presidential election. So that's a good thing. And if there's a new president, excuse me for a moment, then a new president could simply give 30 days notice and the US would be right back in the agreement. So I know there's sports fans here. I'm a sports fan. On rare occasions, there comes a time when you can sense the momentum shifting. Do you know what I mean, sports fans? I've been at some memorable matches, games, where the home team that I'm rooting for is behind on the scoreboard and the clock is ticking down, and then something shifts and it's hard to put your finger on exactly what that is, but it's palpable to both sides. And then as the clock runs out, the home team wins. I really do believe that is the inflection point we are at now. There was a great economist who died about 10, 15 years ago in the US, Rudy Dornbush, who once said, things take longer to happen than you think they will, but then they happen much faster than you thought they could. This movement to remedy the flaws that have created such looming crises, this movement to address the climate crisis and the social problems that have seemed so difficult, we're now gaining momentum. The rising generation wants a better world. You've heard it from them. Some of you are them. Some of you try to recruit them to work for you, and you hear from them that they will work for you if you pay them adequately, but only, in most cases today, if you also give them the legitimate feeling in their hearts that they are going to be about more than simply making money. They're going to have impact. They're going to help make the world a better place. That's what the new generation wants. And it is our job to give them that. Before I close, I want to make one thing clear. I am here because of my limitless respect for Ronnie and because of the honor of this invitation. But I am here not simply to try to impart information to you. I am here to recruit you. We need your help. Most of you have already signed up or you wouldn't be here. So, will we change? Well, there was a great poet in the 20th century in my country who was a businessman and had a gift for poetry and finally became a full-time poet. His name was Wallace Stevens. And one of the lines he wrote was this: after the last no comes a yes. And on that yes, the future world depends. Every great moral movement that has led to the advance of humanity's prospects has been met with an endless series of no's. When Mahatma Gandhi marched to the sea, there were endless no's. Demanding independence, no, 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 until after the last no, there was a yes. Even earlier, the abolition movement seemed hopeless. The civil rights movement in my country, the struggle for women's equality still ongoing, but the struggle for women's suffrage, the struggle against apartheid, more recently the struggle for gay and lesbian rights. If somebody had told me in the US 7 or 8 years ago that in the year 2018 marriage equality would be the law in all 50 US states and would be accepted, honored, and celebrated by 2/3 of the American people, I would have said, well, I hope so, but what are you smoking? I just don't think that's very realistic. But it happened. All of these prior movements went through the same pattern. When the underbrush was cleared away and the stark choice was revealed between what's right and what's wrong, the outcome became foreordained. We must change. We can change. I believe that we will change because it is the right thing to do and because that is who we really are as human beings, working through the complexities of matching the finance with the solutions to the problems that must be solved. That's the work that you are about, and I congratulate you for it. And I'll just close with this. For anyone who believes for 1 second that we as human beings, awake and alive at this moment of crisis and decision, do not have the sufficient political will to make these changes, please remember that political will is itself a renewable resource. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Thank you.